Okay, well, thanks very much, Jen. I'm really pleased to be here. We've literally been working on this case for 2 years, so we're very pleased that the day that we have been able to file it has finally arrived. This case has tremendous significance for students in Rhode Island and also for students throughout the United States, because what we're seeking is a ruling first from the Federal District Court here in Rhode Island, and ultimately, we hope from the U.S. Supreme Court that will make clear, in no uncertain terms, that all students have a right under the United States Constitution to an education that is adequate to prepare them to be capable citizens. So last night, we filed a 45-page complaint setting forth the legal and factual arguments for this. We have 14 plaintiffs who come from all Providence and all parts of Rhode Island who have joined in this effort, and they are representing a class. This is a class action of literally tens of thousands of students throughout the state of Rhode Island who we claim are being denied their constitutional right under the federal Constitution to an education adequate for citizenship. The defendants in the case include Governor Raimondo, the Speaker of the House, the Senate President, the Commissioner of Education, the State Board of Education, and the Council on Elementary and Secondary Education, because we believe that all of these state officials have failed in their constitutional obligation to provide students in Rhode Island the quality education they need to be capable citizens. Why are we emphasizing this concept of citizenship when we're talking about what a constitutional right to education should be? Well, when we go back historically, the purpose of public education in the United States was to prepare young people to be citizens in a democratic society. When this country was established, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, the other founders were very clear that what they were embarking on was really an experiment in a large-scale democratic society of a type that had never existed before. And you know, Benjamin Franklin had the famous quip when he came out of the Constitutional Convention. Somebody said, "What have you created?" And he said, "A republic, sir, if you can keep it." Well, the founders were convinced that the only way you could keep this republic and make their experiment in democracy really work was to make sure that all those who were going to be citizens in this new country were properly educated to take on the responsibilities for being active citizens. Now, admittedly, in those days, those who had the right to vote and become active citizens were a limited part of the population, essentially white males who owned property. But you know, over the last 200 years, the franchise has expanded. Virtually everybody who is a citizen in this country is eligible to vote. Unfortunately, not all of them do. We have one of the lowest voter participation rates throughout the world, and that participation rate is even lower when it comes to young people. So I'm not going to attempt to give you a 200-year history of the evolution of democratic schooling in this country. Suffice it to say, preparation for citizenship has always been the prime purpose of education in this country, but over the last 60 years or so, the schools have increasingly failed to effectively carry out this responsibility, and that's throughout the United States and certainly in Rhode Island in particular. Many reasons you can attribute to this: cynicism about government starting with the Vietnam era, other priorities, the fact that the No Child Left Behind Act and other policies and laws emphasized standardized testing in reading and math to the detriment of social studies and civics. Also, I think the challenges of the 21st century, admittedly, are difficult for schools to cope with. One example, students should be learning how to properly use the internet and social media these days. potentially, it is a powerful source of democratic participation, of reaching out to other people, of understanding a wide range of information, of being able to converse with people from different backgrounds, different races, different parts of the country. But most of our schools are not teaching students how to effectively do that, how to distinguish between fake news and accurate news, how to understand when you look at a website that you've got to be very probing to understand where the people constructing that website have come from. So these are some of the reasons why the challenge in the 21st century is more important than ever, but unfortunately most of our schools really are failing to carry out this responsibility. Let me focus on why did we bring this case in Rhode Island. We could have begun this federal challenge in any state in the country. But one of the reasons is that Rhode Island particularly stands out when it comes to this question of how effectively are the schools preparing kids for citizenship. First of all, there is no requirement that any children take a civics course during their entire schooling experience in Rhode Island. There is no indication that teachers in this state receive specific training in civics or American government. There is no system of state examinations or accountability systems to assess whether students are in fact gaining any knowledge of civics, social studies, or American government by the time they graduate from high school. To show the lack of priority emphasis on civics in the state of Rhode Island, for the past 6 years, the position of Social Studies Coordinator in the State Education Department has remained empty. So these are some of the reasons why when we began exploring where it would make most sense to bring this case, people in Rhode Island, my colleagues here who have joined me on the legal framework, many of the organizations that are supporting the case, these wonderful students that I've met in many of the community meetings that we've had here, we're all emphasizing the importance of this case to Rhode Island in particular, both because of the deficiencies that we see in the current system, and also because my colleagues Steve Robinson, Sam Zurier, have tried not once but twice to petition the Rhode Island Supreme Court to take a stand on adequacy in education for students in this state, and they've been turned down repeatedly. There have been cases seeking adequate education, seeking declarations from the courts in 47 out of the 50 states. Plaintiffs have prevailed in those cases 60% of the time, but Rhode Island is one of the 40% of the states where the state courts are unwilling to act. So it's time to bring this matter, we think, to the federal courts, and we do think that there is an important legal opportunity here. I'm just going to mention very briefly the essence of our constitutional claim, and then I want to turn it back to Jen, and we want to hear from students and the others on the panel here. But just to let you know the basis for this claim, 45 years ago, there was a major case before the United States Supreme Court known as Rodriguez versus San Antonio School District. That case had to do with unequal funding. These plaintiffs in that case were parents of children from poverty backgrounds in San Antonio. They had great educational needs. Their school district was next to an affluent district that was literally across the street. Their kids were receiving literally 50% of the per capita spending of kids in the rich district, even though they had greater needs. So that case went to the U.S. Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court agreed that there was a great inequity and somebody should do something about it. But they made clear it wasn't going to be the federal courts because they didn't want to get involved in the complexities of figuring out how you calculate fair funding, how you compare needs in different school districts. And in writing the decision, it was a close 5-4 decision, the majority said there's not a word about education in the federal Constitution. Education was largely left to the states. So that's why we're going to turn this back to the states. This is not a federal obligation. But as I say, it was 5-4. So we had some strong dissenting opinions at the time. And Thurgood Marshall wrote a stinging dissenting opinion and challenged his colleagues in the majority. And what he said is, okay, there's not a word about education in the federal Constitution, but there is a 15th Amendment that says every citizen has a right to vote. And there is a First Amendment that says every person in the United States has a right to freedom of speech, to petition your government, to exercise all these democratic rights. And Marshall went on. Nobody can effectively exercise these important constitutional rights who hasn't had a basic education. Now that challenge obviously got to the majority of the justices. Lewis Powell wrote the decision for the majority. He knew education. He had been the president of the Virginia State Board of Education. So he didn't deny what Marshall was saying. He came back and wrote, "We don't dispute the fact that there may be some basic level of education necessary to be a capable citizen. But the plaintiffs in this case 45 years ago, didn't make that claim. They just made a claim for more money. They didn't say that they weren't getting the basic education you need for citizenship, whatever that is. We'll leave that for another day." So they left that issue open. And essentially, what we're doing here today, and what these good young people who are among the plaintiffs and my colleagues who are working with me in the lawsuit, what we are trying to do is we're saying the day has come. It's been 45 years. But you know, we're living in troubled times. Our democratic institutions are being challenged like never before. I don't think we can depend on the current generation of politicians and policymakers to get past the polarization, the rigidity of positions, the inability to be able to speak well and respectfully with people with different opinions. But these are the things that our school children should be learning, and our schools should be really emphasizing, because our real hope for reinvigorating our democratic institutions lies with the young people. So that's why this case is timely now, this case is important now, and that's why we have filed this complaint, and we look forward to moving the case along, and we look forward to building understanding and support throughout Rhode Island on what's involved in this case and what people need to do to help us make it a reality.